fuck nice people. He involves himself into, you'll find out, I think in Grounding My Brothers, he actually involves himself and he thinks that's more important besides his academic things, that it's more important to be amongst the masses and actually organize with them. So he stays connected to the masses, even if he's an academic intellectual. Still keeps himself connected to the masses, keeps himself enthralled with the thing. And the thing is the masses' movements to gain liberation. So, yeah, so he's a very, very important person. I would say everybody should. Education in Africa, Chapter 12, and Contemporary Tanzania, Part 1. Education in Africa. In discussing education in Africa, we should first contrast the independent educational system as it exists before the arrival of Europeans with the colonial education system established after 1885, which is a conventional date for the beginning of African colonization. The difference between the two are critical to any real evaluation of contemporary education in Africa. Communal and universal versus particular and elitist societies. Education is dependent. Education in dependent pre-colonial Africa was universal. Everyone receiving either a formal or informal education designed to give him or her a role within society. Within the society, mothers passed on values to other children, and elders acted as models of behavior for the youth. That was informal education, and it went on all the time. It could not be stopped. Formal education is independent. Independent Africa occurred throughout teachings one skills to apprentices. For example, if a man were a hunter, a miner, or a cloth maker, he would educate his children or other family members or other persons in the society in order to preserve his particular craft. In addition to vocational skills, social values was specifically transmitted to the youth at puberty during the rites of initiation. Many societies also had formal training schools for those preparing for you already went up there, for the equivalent of the priesthood. So this very briefly was the African educational system. It provided education for everyone. It had a role for everybody. Colonial education, or European education in colonial Africa, stood in contrast to the above. It was doled out to a minority. Colonial education was elitist because it was based upon elitist philosophical and ideological assumptions derived from European class society as distinct from African society, which was communal and relatively unstratified. Hello. So basically, it was basically like communal living. Oh my God, why did I do that? There we go. Sorry, everybody. Please get Fatima. Okay, good. Where was I at? Oh yeah. In a stratified sociological system, education serves the interests of the dominant class, caste, race, or geographical unit, irrespective of pretensions to the country. Such an education is for the few, education is for the few, rather they be the actual children of the ruling class or children of the exploited or oppressed classes who are co-opted into the service of that system. When the European education system was transported to Africa, it became even more limited and elitist because the purpose of the colonizer within Africa was to select only a very small number of Africans who aid in the work of colonization. The point was made very clear by the colonizer, quote, "Why do we want to educate black people? Because we are running the country. but we cannot do it all on our own. We need some African messengers and translators. We need African clerks in the railways and civil service and the trading companies. We need teachers to train those messengers and clerks, end quote. That is why it became necessary for the colonialists to establish some form of school education in Africa. The African versus the European personality. Next section. Another set of distinctions exists between indigenous African education and colonial education. African education was designed to develop what I call the, quote, African personality, a term which has been used by Kwame Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, and a number of other prominent African spokesmen. It often carries vague mystical overtones, but what I have in mind is simply that a society, both consciously and unconsciously, consciously and unconsciously, develop individuals to sustain its mores and values. The unfettered African society. Africans were part of an extended family. They developed a consciousness of their relationship with their kin, their land, their ancestors. All these factors made up the African personality. Any educational system, so long as it is independent, develops people for purpose which the society internally and independently choose for itself, notwithstanding the fact that a particular sector may be more influential than another in exercising that choice. In the colonial system, it was not the peoples themselves, not the colonized, who set the terms and goals of their education. The colonizer did so. When he educated a few Africans. He did so not to develop them within their African context as Africans, but rather as alienated them from their society from which they came. His purpose was to create or recreate them in his own image, to manipulate and transform the very sense of their African identity, assimilation. The dramatic illustration in this is found in French West Africa, where African school children were told to recite, quote, "The Gauls of our ancestors had blue eyes," end quote. When French school children say this, it is a means of identifying himself with his past. And this is normal in any educational system. But when a colonized Senegalese or a Dahomian is told that the Gauls, his ancestors, had blue eyes, he knows he has black eyes and black skin, he experiences a tremendous sense of alienation. Like, I think Frantz Fanon pointed this out too. I think Frantz Fanon also pointed this out. His sense of who he is his sense of being an African is in danger of collapsing. He becomes instead a black European, which was in fact the purpose of French as well as British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonial education. Hold on a second. What did Noah say? Oh, Noah just gave some gifts. Okay. When Noah. It was designed to alienate a few who received it from the masses of the people as a whole, not to reinforce the connection between those educated in the formal system and the rest of the population. Interdependency versus individualism. Next section. A third set of contrasts is related to the communal nature of African education, which stresses the interdependence of individuals within the society. Work and social efforts had to be collective if they were to be meaningful. This collective emphasis sprang from the structures of the society, which has non-stratified or relatively indifferentiated. Soothed class contradictions that did exist were, by and large, non-antagonistic class contradictions, except in a few areas where feudal or quasi-feudal social forms had come into being. An antagonistic contradiction penetrates to the basic means of production. When the existence of a member of one class depends upon exploiting members of another class, race, or nation, then their interests are antagonistic. In African societies, there were non-antagonistic contradictions based on the division of labor. Such, for instance, was the opposition between pastoralists and cultivators, between whom there was at the same time a considerable degree of interdependence. Also, there was a division of labor in which some individuals became priests, while others wielded political authority. When the division of the social product was relatively egalitarian, a major contradiction does not arise between the priest and ruler. On the other hand, the rest of the subjects on the other hand. And the rest of the subjects on the other hand. In the African situation, it was possible to teach that labor is a collective activity, since this was in accordance with social reality. Colonial education deriving from bourgeoisie values portray labor as even social existence to be competitive. Not only was this idea extolled within the classroom, but in the areas of real life, such progress as was possible within colonial society was granted to Africans because of their personal achievements, thus further separating the individual from the mass of his fellows. No worries. Colonial educational system was competitive in the metropoles, but it was more so in Africa because only a tiny handful, far less than Europe or North America, became as it were the chosen few. A tiny handful went to school, and it was made clear to them that, quote, here it is. Here is your avenue of progress. You have to complete with others to get there. And once you make it within the system, you will establish yourself as a superior individual, not as some part of a collective ideological values were buttressed by material changes, which further differentiate African society. For example, where land used to be the property of the whole community, it became commercialized. Under colonialism, land was bought and sold in Africa, a concept almost unknown previously. Once it was bought and sold, a few individuals got the land, and others had to do without. They became sellers of labor to those who owned the land. The individualist approach struck at the root of the land tenure tradition, and the educational system reinforced the individualism as well derived its rationale from it. Orientation to or away from the life environment. Next section. A final set of contrasts suggests that the original African education was carried forward that may be called the principle of praxis, the unity of theory and practice. One was learning about life. The individual was introduced about the life of the community in order to fulfill its own role within community and simultaneously understand a complement the roles of others. You see that? Learning something and applying it practically. So theory to practice. And now it's saying African versus colonial education. Sweet. African education was specifically oriented towards the practice of day-to-day life. It must be reiterated that educational systems are both formal and informal. We should not hold to the idea that education takes place only if there is a classroom and only if people remain outside of the process of production for months or years. That is the narrow Western conception of education that evolved into a feudalistic and capitalist times. But Africans were educated differently. Consider, as an example, an African pastoralist. Consider as an example the African pastoralist. When Maasai youth, aged 5 or 6, deal with cattle, they are at school. By the time they reach the age of 10, they can distinguish dozens of species of cattle. Their shape, their color of their skin, their particular markups, the shape of their horns, and so on. The MASIA can even identify the species of ticks that come and rest on their cattle. They have gone to school with their cattle because it is essential for their survival and the survival of their community that they should know about cattle, for that is how the community makes its living. Therefore, rather they get the education by formal or informal means, it is at all points linked to the question of practice, of doing, as distinct from a purely abstract appreciation. Colonial education in Africa was hostile to the principles of praxis, partly because of unconscious and ill-considered European premises about education, considered a subject as basic as geography. A European school teacher in the tropical schoolroom in Africa or the West Indies would teach about spring, summer, and autumn, and winter, which relatively few Africans or West Indians would ever have seen. Brought from Europe, the educators too often taught the same thing they would have taught in Europe. But more than that, they insisted that education in Africa be essentially, quote, white collar education. They promoted that they considered to be the values of Christianity and values connected with doing certain types of low-level bureaucratic work. It was a non-specific, non-technical education, unrelated to actual physical environment of Africa. That's the disconnect. We should teach according to the material conditions so we can understand what material conditions we can change and understand contradictions, and then take those into practice. In Europe, a scientific and technological basis has been imparted to education in the late 19th century, and even more so in the 20th century, because such a bias was necessary to the development of capitalist society in Europe. However, because Africa had been allocated the role of primary producer within the imperialist international division of labor, it was not only unnecessary but undesirable and antithetical to the interests of capitalism that African education should take a scientific and technological direction. The colonizers did not want Africans to do anything more than supply labor in its cheapest and crudest form. When, for example, rural Africans in South Africa did manage to get skilled and semi-skilled jobs, the whole racist society galvanized itself to hold back African development, because an African was considered even more of a threat if he had an education and a skill, because he's a threat to the concept of whiteness and white people. Bastards. Fucking white people. He was then either not given a job or given it at the wage as such as 10 times less than that which a European received. The African schoolchild did not receive colonial education very often, was removed physically to a primary or secondary boarding school. Many Africans who experienced this kind of education found that they could no longer relate to their own home communities, or that they had tremendous difficulties in doing so because they weren't teaching based on the material conditions. The church, too, was responsible for outdated forms of African education. By the 19th century, churches in Europe had ceased to play a hegemonistic role in education, which they had played in previous centuries. Europeans had come to the awareness that the church should be separated from the state and from civil education, because the metaphysical approach of Christianity was hostile to the full elaboration of European knowledge, especially in science. For the most part, Europeans very calmly separated the church from their school system. But at the same time that the Europeans were separating the church from their education system, they were bringing the church into Africa. They found it useful. One presumes to create irrelevant and mystifying approach to knowledge, because all they wanted the African to learn was the fear of God. The missionaries said this very clearly, quote, we want to teach them the fear of God, end quote. That's horrible. Section 2, qualitative gains. Qualitative means, we're going to look at qualitative, just so I can get the right definition, so everybody can understand what qualitative means, for those who don't. You know, like, Q, come on. Definition. All right, so qualitative, related to measures or measures by a quality of something rather than its quantity, a high quality excellence. So it's a quality shift. Let's look at quality just real quick. So quality is the standard of something as measured against other things of a similar kind. The degree of excellence of something, a distinctive attribute or characteristic possessed by someone or something. All right. Against the background of colonial and pre-colonial education in Africa, it may be helpful to take a narrower example of Tanzania today to pinpoint some of the things that Tanzania has achieved and some of the things that it has tried to achieve in the educational sphere. The legacy of colonial rule was an extremely high rate of illiteracy throughout the continent. The number of children going to school very seldom went above 1 out of 10, and in some cases it was less than that. In the United States, one talks about high school dropouts and college dropouts, but in Africa, one talks about primary school dropouts. 50% of children in Africa had to contend with the enormous quantitative problem in the area of education. Heretofore, colonial education had only been made available to a very small percentage of the African population. But the government planners of the new African educational system were charged with providing a formal school education for everybody. They had to start thinking in terms of universalizing education, pushed by the demands of the working class. In my opinion, most African countries which attained independence with a few secondary schools and with almost non-existing facilities for technical and university education have done more in 10 years of independence than the colonialists did in 75 years of colonial rule. As far as expanding the physical education facilities are concerned, I have many reservations about some independent African governments, but it is simply an indication of how shabby the colonial regimes were, that in 75 years they did not manage to give to Africans quantitatively even the primary education which the governments in Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and elsewhere are given to their people today. Very seldom does the new education arrive, however, at anything near universal school education, not even in Tanzania. The Tanzanian government projected the year 1980 as the date when it hoped to arrive at universal primary education. This wait is justified by policymakers in terms of lack of finances. Education is a huge financial investment which does not bring immediate returns. It is a long-term investment. Many governments spend 25%, perhaps 30% in their budget on education, and of course, this is not as productive an investment as a farmer or a factory, which will conceivably show returns in 1 to 5 years. In spite of this, many young Tanzania have not been very happy about the idea of accepting incomplete primary education for a number of years. Their imagination has been caught by the kind of experiment which went on in Cuba and which provided the Cuban people with universal literacy, while coming nowhere close to the Cuban, quote, year of education strategy. Tanzania has stepped up its adult education program. President Julius Nyerere argued that because so many of the peasant adults population have been denied the opportunity of education during the colonial period, adult literacy campaigns should become a matter of the highest priority, and Tanzania had one of the more successful adult education programs in Africa. Although it cannot be denied that 10 years of independence has shown a tremendous development in purely quantitative terms, in the number of children going to school and in the number of people in society who received a formal education of the same schoolroom type as had been established under the colonial rule. That is the first achievement. You know what? It would have been nice. Like, I still think I have some illiteracy problems because when it comes to studying, I can't pick up the main things in a paragraph, and I need to work on that further. The elimination of racism. Another early achievement of post-colonial Tanzania was the elimination of racist structures of colonial education. Which reflected the racism of the colonial capitalist world. There were white settlers in Tanzania, although their Kenyan counterparts were more numerous and more notorious. These white settlers received by far the largest portion of the educational budget. Arabic people and Asian people received the next largest slice, and finally, the majority of the people of the land, the Africans themselves, received the scrapings. This racist school structure was promptly attacked and destroyed. Teacher training. The idea of teacher training had to be seriously reconsidered because part of the process of African alienation resulted from the physical presence of white teachers in African schools who, whether or not they consciously subscribed to all the goals of colonial rule, reflected the basis of individualism of the metropoles and the racism inherited throughout the elite, the capitalist world. Since Tanzania had been one of the more, quote, backward colonies, few Africans were trained to be teachers at the time of independence. Its leaders wanted to expand their school system, but the teachers who were already entrenched there were primarily white expatriates and Asian people who did not always opt for national status. The university opened its first college of arts, social science, and natural science in 1965, and it was used virtually as a teacher training institution. A program was devised by which an undergraduate could emerge at the end of his studies as a teacher into subjects. Normally, within the British system, one earns a bachelor's degree before proceeding to study for a year or 2 years to acquire a teaching certificate considered appropriate for the secondary school teaching. Tanzania had to break with that practice and integrate teacher training within the undergraduate program. About 80% of all the early graduates went straight from the university into the secondary schools to meet the priority of the Tanzanization. A small example of the consequences of Tanzanization can be seen in the return of traditional dance, Gamo, within the school system at both primary and secondary levels. Music and dance have always been dominant African art forms, and they were relevant to culture in ways that were far more fundamental than mere recreations. Not only has Gamo been revived in the schools, but the traditional forms have been given a new content, a new thrust. The words the students sing and the scenes they act out in Gamma, I don't know how to say it, might today be reflected in Ujamaa, the collective, for example. Or they may even be concerned with the question of defense against the Portuguese. So there is a merge of new political content with old African form. Next section, the National Service Program. The National Service Program. Beyond the quantitative changes and the more obvious transformation of the school structure, one confronts much more complicated questions. Tanzania has had to struggle to retrieve its education form from the colonial to the distinctively African path. At the same time, these African values had to be set in the forward-looking context of socialist reconstruction. A key problem is that colonialism, like any other social system, has means of self-perpetuation. Africanization, per se, could not break the continuity of colonial education, given that African teachers had been taught by Europeans within a European value framework. In effect, the African teachers was often a, quote, programmed European, making Fanon's phrase, quote, black skins, white masks, end quote, even more apt when it initially appears, since the mark of an indigenous African practice symbolized a complete change of identity on the part of the wearer. Higher institutions of learning in Africa were particularly prone to emphasize colonial continuity, often under the guise of maintaining, quote, international standards. Any African teacher who had access to higher education, either before or after independence, was likely to be an elitist, as the European who preceded him, alienated from his African roots, and as individualist as though he had been socialized in Britain or the US. So like what they're saying is they lost all connection and tried to assimilate as much as possible into like this new thing, and instead of like maintaining your connection to your roots. So that's what the assimilation process of these metropoles do. They come back and they're like they said, it says made in the image of Europe, European image. TT crashed. Oh, goddamn. All right. Okay. The National Service was perceived as a device to induce change at a practical and normative kind of Tanzania. It was instituted as a means of bringing a number of youth into more active participation in the life of their community. One of its principal aspects was the provision of the rudiments of military training for self-defense. Colonialism disarmed the African people except for those who served the master in the colonial armies. One of the first things which the National Service did was to revive the normal practice whereby the youth are entrusted with the physical defense of the society. At the same time, the National Service revived the principle that education should provide real skills, practical skills, as distinct from, quote, white-collar education. So the National Service offered agricultural and craft skills regarded to relevant to the question of economic development. Its first recruits were youth with primary and lower secondary education. The National Service also rested on the premise that young people should be educated to serve rather than to command peasants and workers. University graduates represented the pinnacle of the old elitism. They had to learn to reintegrate. Let me make sure I'm saying this word right. Reintegrate? I think it's reintegrate, but I'm going to make sure. Yeah, reintegrate themselves within the rest of the population. Therefore, in 1966, the National Service Act was extended to cover secondary and university students previously exempt from its provisions. Tanzania university students completed their training that year were required to enter national service. Like everybody else, they were to live in a national service camp for 6 months and were to be trained by instructors who often had only primary school education. At the camp, servicemen received an allowance. For a subsequent 18 months, they were to make a contribution of 60% of their salary to the national budget. University students promptly demonstrated to signify their non-acceptance of these terms. This was confrontation of the people versus the elite, and being an elite without power, university students were disciplined to perform national service in order to complete their education. Now, secondary school graduates proceed immediately to national service camps for some months before joining the university. The national service program succeeded to a limited extent. After setting out on a difficult task of refashioning people's values, it has not surprisingly ended up with a degree of formalism. Let's look at what formalism means real quick. We're going to look at what formalism is. See if I can spell it without looking. There it is, right? Back. Formalism. And formalism is excessive adherence to prescribed forms, or a description of something in formal method. Okay, I think it's the first. Excessive adherence. In other words, students will go to the national service and they will do what they are told, but they will not necessarily accept the idea that they are there to serve the people and merge within the community of producers. No one in Tanzania would be so naive to say that the national service works perfectly, or to suggest that months of work of national building projects will create new sense of identity for servicemen. One of the oh my gosh, let me look at this word. Not even gonna try it yet. Hold on. I think it's excruciating.
Excruciating.
Yeah. Excruciating problems is that the national service is shot through within. Oh my gosh. I don't know this word. We're going to look this word up. Hierarchicalization. Hierarchicalization. I gotta hear it. All right, let's find out. Of course, it's not gonna let me say it out loud, is it? So it's a archization is a process of arranging things in a rank order, typically by importance, authority, or status. It establishes a hierarchy, creating a system where elements were organized into levels, such as a military structure with a commander in chief at the top of various levels of officers below. Okay. And commandism. Okay, cool. Let me read that. One of the excruciating problems is that the national service is shot through the hierarchization and commandism. I have no idea what's going on there. Stop talking. Commandism, which is antithetical to its own goal of maximum participation along socialist and democratic lines. While giving a highly political task to perform, its direction at various levels is manifestly, quote, apolitical, which means, in effect, petty bourgeoisie. A political education wing was incorporated in the national service at an earlier date, but it appears to have been swamped rather than to have expanded in the manner that would allow the institution to be considered a cadre forming one. For the moment, the most positive thing that can be said about the national service is that the structures have been set up and that meaningful goals have been defined, which goes far beyond the structures and goals of the colonial education system. So despite the critiques, it still goes beyond and further than the colonial education. Got it. So it's still good. It just needs to be revamped because nothing's perfect, and everything is due to critiques and criticism in order to expand it, make it better, and advance it. So it can't be perfect, but it's better than the colonial education that they were receiving. The national language. Tanzania has been fortunate in being one of the few African countries with an authentic national language. There are dozens of linguistic, I gotta hear it. How come I can't say that dang word? Linguistic. As soon as I go look it up, linguistic units in Tanzania. But with a few exceptions, everybody can communicate in Swahili. Most observers have commented on this phenomenon as evidence of Tanzanians' national and territorial integrity. In addition, the existence of Swahili as a lingua franca was implications with regard of transcending both stratification and internal orientation. English, which was the teaching medium in the colonial secondary schools, was one of the mechanisms of alienation. The continued use of English and French in post-colonial Africa helps keep the African petty bourgeoisie attached to their masters. With the introduction of Swahili as a language of national education, those who entered the secondary schools were offered the opportunity to define their vision of the world in a language which grew out of their own environment. There also emerged the possibility of using an idiom which could bind together the peasantry and the upper class, in contrast to the European language, the use of which previously divided them. English is still the language of instruction at the university, in which the higher reaches of the secondary school, because it takes time to make the transition to Swahili. Textbooks have to be developed and new concepts have to incorporate into the language. So that means when we move to a socialist model in top of socialist education that gets rid of the hyper-individualism and starts teaching collectivism and being part of a community, we're going to have to change the textbooks, the structures of classes. So that has to happen too. So that's a good point. Some foot dragging in the practical implementation of the national language policies is evident. It is probably due in part to the lack of self-confidence in most of the petty bourgeoisie and their wish to continue in English language identification with the metropoles. The metropoles are like the town centers, the ones that actually produce. Usually the metropoles are in the imperialist nations. But I think some metropoles, they do talk about being in the cities that they made. However, debate in the local circles has produced the consensus that Swahili can and must take precedence at all levels of communication, including the university. So they're trying to bring back their traditions and stuff that was stolen and stripped from them. It's amazing. The reconnection. That's reconnection, everybody. That's reconnection. Education for self-reliance. We're doing great on time. In the wake of the famous Ashura Declaration in 1967, we're going to look up that declaration right now. The Arusha. We're going to look it up. He probably says it, but let's look it up. A-R-U-S-H-A Declaration. There it is. Let's look this up. So the Ashura Declaration was made in 1965. Policy statements in Tanzania President Julius Nyerere that committed the nation of socialism and self-reliance. Its goals were to promote social equality, national economic development, self-sufficient through state control of key industries, and the creation of collective farming villages, known as Yajama villages. While it united the country and aimed for a classless society, the declaration ultimately faced challenges and was largely abandoned. Okay, we'll find that out. Okay. Mwaluwuma Nyerere made public a major policy document on the education entitled Education and for Self-Reliance. It should be borne in mind that the subtitle of the Ashura Declaration was quote TANU, Policy of Socialism and Self-Reliance. The emphasis on self-reliance thereafter became a principal theoretical premise for educational reconstruction. Education for self-reliance starts with an awareness that the colonized were educated to be dependent upon the colonizer. Let me reread that. Education of self-reliance starts with an awareness that the colonized were educated to be dependent upon the colonizer. An education for independence. In contrast, the goal of Tanzania in the conceptualized socialist self-reliant Tanzania was that they should be dependent on their own efforts, their own skills, their own creativity. Education under colonialism was mainly supported by the state or church. So even with us, we're going to have to go through that process of deconstructing all this shit that we were taught in schools. It's why rectification programs, in my eye, should be a thing to culture revolution. After the smashing and destroying of institutions, we should incorporate rectifying or re-education, because we're all going to still need to be re-educated, I feel. That is to say, Africans pay taxes and generate surplus out of which the colonial administration or the church allocate funds for education. Those who went through the formal educational system were removed from production and kept at specifically privileged persons for the duration of their secondary education. Patterns such as these were challenged in education for reliance. The colonial education system was a pyramid, starting off with a narrow base of primary education, becoming extremely narrow at the secondary level, and tapering off sharply at the point of higher education. Kind of like here, but probably more sharp with in Africa. The education for self-reliance insisted that the national educational system could not have as its goal a well-being of a few at the top. A change of priorities was required so that the edifice could be built up around the well-being of the majority. Under the colonial system, primary school was not an end in itself, for it meant nothing to emerge after 6 years of primary school. The primary school graduate was considered by the colonialists a potentially better laborer or cultivator, but the African who was to help in administration need to proceed further, given the quote white collar end quote orientation of the colonial society. Africans also accepted that the purpose of education could only be achieved by climbing the pyramid. The new approach in Tanzania was based on the contentions that it is absurd to spend millions of shillings on an educational system whose end product is a handful of trained people, especially since the only thing they can do is minister the country rather than spearhead production. If only a handful still continue to reach the top of the educational pyramid in independent Tanzania, that would constitute a secondary achievement. The major focus was to be a primary education, because only in this sphere could the policymakers conceive of giving everybody an education in the near future. All primary school graduates had to be fitted for service in society rather than as misfits with no meaningful jobs, as happened in colonial Africa and has happened in neo-colonial Africa. The goal of the self-reliant education led to a re-evaluation of the age at which children should start school. Generally, the starting age is 6 years, and at 12, the child is finished with primary schooling. The logic behind the TANU decision to start school at a later age was that a primary school graduate of 12 years or less is neither physically nor mentally equipped to assume the role of producer in society. Consequently, in 1963, the starting age was pushed upwards to 7 years, and the school leaving age to 14 years. Increasingly enough, the pre-colonial African society, a child became an adult at the time of puberty. Initiatory. Is that initiatory? I'm gonna make sure. Initiatory rites of passage, quote unquote, meant that the girls became a woman and the boys a man. The European conception of a teenager, some who is unproductive for 4 or 5 years, was totally unheard of. The policy of education of self-reliance placed a lot of emphasis on agricultural work because the vast majority of people in the country earned their living from subsistence. The colonial educational approach was designed to downgrade and degrade manual work, particularly as it related to agriculture. That is why the educated African elite despised and still despise the peasants. When the colonialists did introduce agricultural education, as happened in several areas, it did not allow for the improvisation or innovation. It was agricultural instructions of the crudest form, based on the premise that hoeing the land through the expenditure of sheer physical energy was a natural lot of Africans. Jesus Christ. So get a baking system as Pablo Freire, just putting it in directions and know you know what, if we can improve this, we can improve this better, not giving them the routes or the means to be like, no, we can improve this and here's how we should do this, and like actually implementing and seeing if it works. looking at things scientifically and actually improving on things. No, instead, you do what you're told. Education for self-reliance, on the other hand, asserts the dignity of African labor and aims to strengthening the connection between theory and practice, so that school children can be involved creatively with their environment. I fear that we need, like a lot of us adults are going to need to do that. We're going to have to go back to school as children and learn. labor in the field was not to be punished as it was in colonial era, but a exercise of scientific utilization and natural resources. In this framework, school farms have become very important to the development of the education for self-reliance movement in Tanzania. The farm is useful in that it can provide revenue for the school, but that, I think, is a secondary purpose. Much more relevant are the attitudes connected with agricultural labor and the possibilities of innovation and the experience of study and work. Within the self-reliant educational environment, the whole school community of teachers and students act as a democratic entity. The students and their teachers are supposed to set priorities, determine what is to be planted and what is not, how it is to be done, how it is to be marketed, and to what use funds will be put. The school, like in a Ujamaa community, is not to be an exercise of self-government, whereas colonialism was the negation of that self-government. Some observers have belittled the significance of self-reliant education by pointing out that this idea and many others are not at all new, having been mooted and experimented upon during the colonial period. What they fail to recognize is the limiting and distinguishing factors of the colonial political economy, and the fact that the same policies can assume radically different meaning within the new social order. It would have been unrealistic to the point of infantilism to accept even the most honest and colonial agricultural educational programs to convince Africans of the merits of agriculture, when the colonial value structure deriving from the mode of production pointed to the success of those who abandoned direct participation in agriculture and engaged instead in more, quote, civilized pursuits. These observers fail to address themselves to fundamental issues, such as who wields power and whose interests. And the policy of education for self-reliance opens up revolutionary possibilities because it is a decision of the people in their own interest. To suggest that the colonialists had the same vision of African well-being is an exercise in apologenetics, and not a subtle one at that. One commentator have lined up for or against education and self-reliance in terms of their assessment of its class content and significance for socialism. Thus, the Pan-Africanist Marxist MZ C.R.L. James waves ecstatically about the document. He affirms that, quote, the simplicity with which Dr. Nyerere states that his government purposes to distinguish the fact that not to Plato or in Aristotle, Roussy or Karl Marx will you find such revolutionary departures from the established educational order. C.R.L. James is a much influenced by what is within the document as by the creation of Ujamaa socialism, which he regards as a revolutionary response to the objective conditions of Tanzania and Africa. On the other hand, a negative assessment has been offered by the American educationist Philip Foster, which is filled with bourgeoisie assumption. He expresses a firm commitment to class society in Africa on the grounds that they are conflicts objectives of equality and efficiency, end quote. He has conceived that future progress in Tanzania and Africa must mean further class stratification. His real quarrel with education for self-reliance is that not only does it hark back to traditional African communalism, but it also points forward to a new socialism, starting with the countryside. Of course, 5 years after the promulgation of the policy, a more rewarding activity is not to contemplate it as theory, but rather to focus on its implementation to date. The Brazilian educationist Pablo Freire is a person that everybody should investigate. He did a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Good book. If you're very, it's a high level book. Pablo Freire, when asked to comment on education for self-reliance in Tanzania, replied that it looked liberating on paper, but that the answer would only be found in praxis because, quote, the question is not, is it, but to do it. Okay, the question is not, is it, but do it, end quote. Studies on the practical meaning of self-reliance programs in Tanzania schools are in their infancy, but even the casual awareness of the Tanzanian contemporary scene suggests that education for self-reliance has not been working according to plan. Far from it. Inevitably, with such a complex matter, people grasp the formal and superficial aspects first. Many school teachers think that education for self-reliance means having a farm. They decide to have a farm, and, quote, self-reliance, end quote, is placed on a timetable just like physics, mathematics, or history. At a given time, the students go out, they work, they come back in, but no serious attempt are made to integrate the different aspects of curriculum so that it points in a given direction. Teachers may seldom make any attempts to involve students in determining what constitutes self-reliant activity in their respective regions. They still use the authoritarian bureaucratic approach, although they might boast of self-reliance in their schools. In this connection, their class allegiances and ideological outlooks are factors of great importance. So that's another critique. That's another critique of the lack of the teachers actually engaging and allowing students to actually engage with a democratic process and how things should be ran and stuff. Education and liberation. Ultimately, the success of the schoolroom revolution is itself dependent on the development of structures and patterns within the society as a whole. Tanzanian education is trying to create new norms, but at the same time, the total society must be moving in a given direction. These two things are mutually supportive. In Tanzania, serious attempts have been made to create new structures and establish new norms in many aspects of the political economy. They all have a bearing on the attempted revolution in education. During the early 1960s, students scoffed when they were told, when they were told to limit their aspiration for the future and regard themselves as servants of the people. They asked, quote, how can the politicians driving in their Mercedes-Benz, accumulating real estate, joining capitalist companies, telling us to be socialist? When university students demonstrated against the national service in 1966, in 1966, one of the things they said was that if they were to have a 60% cut in their salaries for the time spent in national service, then something should be done about the cabinet ministers, principal secretaries, and other top civil servants. Although President Nyerere disciplined them and sent them home for a year, it is significant that this student revolt sparked the Ashura Declaration. Nyerere agreed that the political leadership should discipline itself. He cut his salary by 20%, and other cabinet ministers followed suit. For those who did not initiate this sacrifice voluntarily, a law was passed to reducing the salaries of top civil servants. Much of the Ashura Declaration was in fact devoted to outlining a code of behavior for the top echelon of the society. Outside of the private business sector, that leadership code was something of self-denying ordinance, which has since been used as a yardstick to measure observance or non-observance of socialist ethics in the lifestyles of the nation, politico-bureaucratic leadership. The TANU leadership code achieved some correlations with values in the educational system. One cannot have a constant contradiction between practice in the political and educational arenas. Children who follow certain models and the most important model actualized within the society cannot be flagrantly out of step with those idealized in the classroom. Similarly, as far as agriculture is concerned, a lot of small-scale capitalist ventures were encouraged in Tanzania in the early 1960s, but in the most recent period, collective Ujamaa agriculture has been given the greater sanction. It makes sense to have a notion of Ujamaa given structural form in agricultural community at the same time that they are being extolled in schools. Furthermore, when children leave the schools where they have been taught the value of communal and collective efforts, they have before them the possibility of joining a Ujamaa village and thereby becoming a permanent part of the movement for the construction of socialism, as shaped and conditioned by their history and environment. How far this possibility is realized and how effective the Ujamaa villages are themselves are of course questions which immediately arise to demand an answer. The transformation of the colonial education system in Tanzania and Africa as a whole is part of a much broader front of combat against imperialism and neocolonialism internally and externally. Although it is a critical, important aspect, educational transformation alone will never lead to a total liberation of society. Indeed, it is dialectically impossible to profound change to take place in the old educational systems within antecedent and concomitant transformation of all aspects of the political economy. Processes is therefore the same as the evaluation of the prospects of socialist revolution and total liberation from colonialism and neocolonialism in the long run. This evaluation must be based on the manifold contradiction of imperialism which are tearing it apart and which have transformed it into a moribund part of the world order. In the short run, the dynamic of change within Africa is determined mainly by its configuration of emergent class society and by the rate at which the mass of direct producers acquire the consciousness and of consciousness of and capacity to act in their own interests, with the support of intellectuals drawn from all strata. From these reasons, our discussions of education must rest suspended, since the examination of the above short and long run trends is beyond the modest scope of this analysis. Section 4, Building Socialism. I think this is the last section. Let's see where we're going. Let's see what we got. Let's see what we got here. Let me look ahead. Oh my gosh. I'm going to have to find a stopping point. Yep. Looks like I'm going to have to find a stopping point. All right, let's do this. Tanzania, socialism. Tanzania, Ujamaa. I got a little piece of thing. And scientific socialism. This chapter attempts to identify Tanzania Ujamaa within scientific socialism and certain ideological essentials. It is an exercise in theory, bearing in mind that historically, the theory of socialism precedes the establishment of socialism as a system in any part of the globe. Scientific socialism, or Marxism, if you like, is an explicit worldview which contemplates every conceivable phenomenon from protein to literature in terms of methodology applicable to nature and society. Therefore, the comparison of Tanzania Ujamaa is not completely analogous, since the latter is neither implicit nor all-embracing. However, the same kind of reservation could probably be expressed for any ideological variant other than scientific socialism. One must, in most cases, seek ideology in human action, combined to greater or lesser extent with statements of principle or policy. The Tanzanian political process was produced over the last decade several noteworthy declarations